Want to welcome you all to the City Club presentation today, and it's really great to see such a large crowd here for our presentation on how the Trump administration's policies regarding Mexico and Canada impact Whatcom County. My name's Jim Britton, and I'm the president of the board for City Club. The mission of City Club is to inform, connect, and engage our community to strengthen the civil health of our region. We emphasize civil conversations and listening to others. We begin by acknowledging with humility that the land where we are today is the territory of the people of the Salish Sea. Their presence is imbued in the waterways, shorelines, valleys, and mountains of the traditional homeland of the Coast Salish people, and it has been that way since time immemorial. I'd like to thank those of you who were assisted, who volunteered to make this happen today. Let's acknowledge those people. In addition, a big thank you for our sponsors who provide substantial support for our programs, including this one. And they are Peace Health, St. Joseph's Medical Center, Baron Quinn Maxwell, Claude and Bruce and Claudia Descend, Danny Neal, real estate broker for the Moyoc Group, Firehouse Arts and Events Center, Colson CPAs, Opportunity Council, Pacific Continental Realty, Unity Care Northwest, Village Books, Western Washington University, Whatcom Community Foundation, and the Salish Current. Give them a big acknowledgement, please. In addition, I'd like to thank our caterers for today, Good Bowls, and our videographers, Talking to Crows. For those of you who are not members, I'd like to encourage you to consider becoming a member. The dues that members pay provide a lot of the support necessary for us to continue to do the work we're doing. To become a member, dues are $40 a person, $75 for a household, and $10 for those who are under 25. And you get an additional break because if you're a member, you'll pay $5 less on your meal when you come to the meetings. If you're interested, there are several ways you can become a member. One, on the tables, there's should be a handout, and you could fill that out and leave it there, and we will then pick it up and touch base with you to get the dues. Or if you'd like to take care of it today, our treasurer, Zach Nordwell, is back there at the table by the door, and you could just go back there and say you'd like to become a member, and then you could pay and become a member immediately. Or you could visit our website. So some of you may remember about a year ago we had a program on the progress on the planning and development of the jail. And we're going to now, about a year later, revisit that. So to refresh everyone's recollection, in November of 2023, the voters, after rejecting two previous initiatives, finally approved one for a facility. But a big part of that was including programs for diversionary programs based on and mental health support. In May, we're going to have a panel to analyze how things are going. What's the progress? And they're going to analyze, in particular, treatment and diversion programs that currently exist, how the planning process is going for programs for the new facility, and what is the progress to date on planning and ultimate construction of this facility. Our guests will include Stark Follis, who is the director of the Public Defender's Office, Barry Buchanan, one of our County Councilman, and Kayla Schott-Bressler, Whatcom County Deputy Executive. So this should be a really interesting program. It was certainly a controversial matter for years, and it's good. It will be interesting and enlightening to find out what's happened and where we stand. I want to talk about next meeting. In addition to the program, the next meeting is also our annual meeting. And we have a little more to do in this annual meeting than we do sometimes. We have 5 new board members that we're going to present for approval, and because the code that applies to nonprofits changed, we've had to amend our bylaws. So those 2 things would be part of the meeting. As a consequence, we are going to start 10 minutes early. So plan to come here. We're going to start at 11:50. We're going to do the annual meeting, and then we'll do the main meeting on the jail. So I'd like to now remind you, if you haven't already done so, please silence your phones. And with that, I will introduce our moderator for this program, Chris Roselli.
Thank you, Jim. Well, good afternoon, everyone. On this beautiful spring day, we live in such a beautiful part of the world. And I would like to welcome you to Shifting Borders, how the Trump administration's policies regarding Mexico and Canada impact Whatcom County. As Jim mentioned, my name is Chris Roselli. I'm the Director of Community Relations at Western Washington University, and I'm fortunate to sit on the Bellingham City Club program committee. It never cut out for you, Jim. Why is it cutting out for me? You have a smooth voice, something I must not have. So last month's event was titled "What Lies Ahead for U.S. Diplomacy and Leadership in the World?" And this is sort of a continuation of the discussion about the impacts or potential impacts of the current administration's policies. And this one is really more focused a bit more locally about our borders, our border to the north with Canada, and our border to the south with Mexico, and its potential impacts on border communities, and of course, Whatcom County and Bellingham certainly being one of them. The Trump administration's early foreign and domestic policies have significantly influenced the U.S. economy, social dynamics, and border communities like Whatcom County, particularly through tariffs and stricter immigration measures, and of course, economic uncertainty that it can create. It also can create, or has created, a little bit of a declining sentiment, as we have seen from our Canadian neighbors as well. Many of you have probably noticed that Canadians are not coming across the border at the rate that what they once were. So as these policies are put into place and as social dynamics and sentiment shift, the question is, how does that impact border communities like Whatcom County, and what does our history and border policy with Mexico and its impact on southern border communities tell us about the potential direction that we might be heading with Canada? Well, we are extremely fortunate to have Doctors Laurie Trautman and LaTrelle Scherffius in our community, and they will discuss how these shifting policies are reshaping U.S. border security, examining historical context from the U.S.-Mexico border to better understand current developments along the U.S.-Canadian border. And I'm sure they will share some thoughts about the potential future of programs like Nexus and the implications for communities like ours near the border. So our first speaker is LaTrelle Scherffius. Dr. LaTrelle Scherffius holds a BA in Latin American Studies and Political Science from Vanderbilt University and a master's and PhD in history from Montana State University, where she became fascinated with the history of the U.S.-Mexico border wall as both a physical barrier and symbolic gesture. At Montana State, she taught Spanish and a popular class entitled The U.S.-Mexico, come on, microphone. The U.S.-Mexico Border, History, Politics, and Culture. The class culminated in an annual student research trip that examined border militarization, asylum Thank you, Jane. The class culminated in annual student research trips that examined border militarization, asylum processes, and humanitarian aid. In addition to her teaching, she led a team of students that digitally preserved archival materials documenting the experiences of Salvadoran refugees living in camps in Honduras in the wake of the Salvadoran Civil War. She also holds a certificate degree in international nonprofit management from the Monterey Institute in California and has worked with NGOs in Nicaragua and along the U.S.-Mexico border. Recently retired and new to Bellingham, her passions include painting, along with boating and camping with her husband and giant Newfoundland dogs. So, LaTrelle, welcome to Bellingham, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning, and thank you very much. I'm going to try to put this microphone here, so I don't have to. We'll see if that works. If you can't hear me, let me know, okay? So, I'd like to thank Jane and Chris and everyone involved in planning today's events. It's so nice being in Bellingham finally. We're moving in at the moment, and this is just a real pleasure to be with all of you here today. So my job today is to introduce you to the changing nature of the southern border in all of its craziness, right? The southern border is a place where migrants, militias, border patrol, and aid workers work, and where immigration attorneys, craven politicians, and conspiracy theorists meet. But, and this is important, it is far from the doom and gloom that you see in the news. It's mostly a place where hot dogs are wrapped in bacon and served with grilled chili peppers, and where high school mariachi bands perform at halftime at football games. And like here in the north, it's where families, it's where families get up every morning, get dressed for school and work, and cross the border for Sunday lunch with relatives. Talk to people along the southern border, and they will tell you it's far from the dangerous hellscape that politicians in D.C. want you to think. Life isn't bad, but it's also not what it used to be. I think this is bothering me, so I'm going to just hold it. It turns out that things are more difficult at the southern border. And it's not the immigrants or the cartels that are to blame. Rather, it's the billions of dollars that have been invested over the past 30 years in hardening the border. So before I begin, I'd like to say that I don't have a crystal ball. And I certainly don't want to scare anyone. There are so many important differences between the northern border and the southern. But I do want for us to know what our southern friends are going through. There might be important lessons for us here in the north. I don't believe in the adage that history repeats itself. Rather, history is important because it reveals what is possible. And it's in that spirit of possibility you today. To do so, let's start in the Oval Office. So here are two photographs, both taken at the Oval Office meetings, just 2 weeks apart. If you look carefully at the room, you can see that aides have replaced one of the portraits. Do you all see that? That's right. President Trump instructed aides to swap founding father Thomas Jefferson's portrait for that of James K. Polk, our 11th president. As Trump put it, he got a lot of land, and that he did. Okay, am I cutting out again? Okay. While in office, Polk oversaw 3 huge land deals in only 4 years. The most controversial of these land deals happened in 1846, when Polk manufactured a crisis at the then southern border and declared war on Mexico. The Mexican-American War remains one of the most belligerent and consequential undertakings by a U.S. president ever, and that is saying a lot. The war ended in 1848 with Mexico losing a full 1/2 of its territory, and the U.S. adding what is now all of the area in red. We don't know a lot about this war, do we? And except for Texas, which has its own crazy history, and the little sliver of blue underneath the red, which was given to the U.S. by treaty from Mexico in 1853, this is how the U.S. southern border came to be. Many historians note that Trump sounds a lot like Polk. He talks in Polk-like terms, an expansionist of old. He's a believer in manifest destiny, the idea that America has the right, the God-given right, to expand into territory that it wants, something that I suspect that Professor Trautman will be talking about in relation to Canada. But since the Mexican-American War and what we have seen at the southern border has been largely defensive, right? A defensive strategy to stop the flow of people and drugs. And that's where I'd like to turn now. People at the southern border talk about border theatrics, and it's true. Politicians from every corner of the country have come here to have their picture taken in a show that they're against the phantom of open borders and tough on immigration, crime, and drugs. Here we have Biden, Harris, Trump doing their part. Of course, there were earlier versions, Pat Buchanan, John McCain. And some of the photo ops are right out of central casting. Here we have Congressman Ryan Zinke of Montana and Department of Homeland Security Director Kristi Noem, both riding the borderline like sheriffs of old. And I love the one on the bottom here. That's Ted Cruz on the Rio Grande in Texas. He looks like he's auditioning for Martin Sheen's part in Apocalypse Now. These politicians have made good political hay by tapping into the militarization of the southern border. You could make a good argument that it got President Trump elected twice. Basically, militarization is the process of using highly trained personnel, tactics, and technologies to transform the border from a largely civilian space, sometimes an international space, into an area of increased surveillance, control, and at times state-sanctioned vigilance. So here's what militarization at the southern border looks like. It's towers with day and night cameras. It's underground sensors, helicopters, planes, trucks, ATVs, and drones. It's specially trained personnel. It's checkpoints with screening technologies like these cameras that record license plate information. It's military personnel like the 7,000 plus active duty troops that Trump recently deployed at the Arizona-New Mexico border. Admittedly, at times it can look dystopian, like these robotic dogs that CBP is testing for the purpose of deployment. Or it looks like specially trained forces, like these elite Border Patrol officers. To date, militarization along the border has been uneven, with some sections highly militarized and others relatively untouched. But last week's executive order to empower active military along the borderline into what's called the Roosevelt Reservation transferred a 60-foot strip along the borderline into the hands of the U.S. military. The implications of this are huge. For the first time, active troops will have the authority to arrest, detain, and deport migrants. And I might also add citizens who enter this zone. And of course, there are ongoing plans to build more border walls in places like this the San Rafael Valley in Arizona, which mostly is characterized by old family cattle ranches. The current era of militarization began with Bill Clinton in the early 1990s with the construction of a border fence along the San Diego-Tijuana border. Clinton's border fence cut Friendship Park, a binational park, in two. Since Operation Gatekeeper, the U.S. government's border strategy has been one of deterrence. Basically, the idea being the more treacherous you make it to cross the border, the less people will try. The strategy was to fortify borders to the east and to the west and pinch migration into and through the Sonoran Desert. The hope was that people would stop coming when faced with the prospect of crossing this brutal and dangerous geography. But of course, people continued to cross, and they died by the thousands. Indeed, each red dot on this map represents a confirmed death, and countless others remain unaccounted for. Conservative estimates suggest between 8,000 and 10,000 people have lost their lives crossing the Sonoran Desert since Operation Gateway. Other people suggest that the number is closer to 20,000. Last year, the U.S. spent over $7.3 billion on Border Patrol. Adjusted for inflation, that's an increase of 765% since Operation Gatekeeper began and the launching of deterrence-based initiatives. That number does not include the tens of billions of dollars allocated to border barriers or walls or money spent on detention, National Guard troops, etc. An estimated 85% of these border funds have been directed towards the southern border. With all of this militarization, the southern border has come to represent a bonanza for specialty contractors. Just last week, thousands of law enforcement officials met in Phoenix at the 2025 Border Security Expo, where over 225 companies peddled the latest and greatest border technologies, and attendees networked alongside Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem and border czar Tom Homan. Despite all of the money being made, the militarization of the southern border has proven extremely disruptive to border communities and wildlands, however, and that's what I would like to examine next. Let's start in Nogales along the Arizona-Sonora border. So this is a picture of two sides of the border wall that divides Nogales, Arizona. On the left, from Arizona on the left and Nogales, Sonora on the right. You can see the concertina wire on the U.S. side, put up by National Guard troops in 2019. On the Mexican side, there's an art installation memorializing the people that have died crossing. Like most twinned border cities, ambos Nogales, the two cities of Nogales, are economically intertwined. Kimberly-Clark, Continental Auto Parts, Master Lock are among the 100 companies that have been lured to the region with favorable tax incentives and low labor cost. They make a wide variety of products for export. After NAFTA, the number of these maquiladoras, or small factories, boomed. Today in Nogales, Sonora, maquiladoras generate a full 55% of its GDP and employ some 34,000 people. There's a robust distribution network on both sides to move these goods around and also to cater to food importers and exporters. You see, over 60% of fruits and vegetables imported from Mexico for distribution to the U.S. and Canada come across the border here. Tomatoes, watermelons, cucumbers, squash, bell peppers. And it's the fourth largest crossing of exports from the U.S. headed south, transporting grains, electronics, and other agricultural products into Mexico. But living in ambos Nogales also brings a different sort of challenge. In 2023, without local input or warning, a large white surveillance blimp appeared on a hillside in a residential neighborhood roughly 1 mile from the border. It was one of 18 purchased by CBP at a cost of $52 million. The Santa Cruz County Sheriff described the frustration of residents and called the blimp disgusting. He continued, quote, "The government isn't transparent or accountable to the people that live here. This is yet another Big Brother intrusion, and I hope the community doesn't get used to it and think of it as one more fixture of the growing police state along the border." 8 months later, and after intense community pushback, CBP agreed to remove the blimp. But removing the blimp didn't mean less surveillance. Instead, the agency announced that they would move away from blimps towards surveillance towers. These towers, sometimes located miles from the actual border, saturate the region and are concentrated in urban areas like Nogales. According to Homeland Security's 2024 budget, there are 191 fixed towers already in place, and DHS plans to add an additional 277 more. If you look at the map, those are the existing towers. And there are other privacy concerns. Travel north out of Nogales and you go through a secondary checkpoint. This is 25 miles north of the border, right? Where Latinos are 20 times more likely to be pulled into secondary inspection, and where Border Patrol agents are empowered to carry out warrantless searches. There are 34 permanent interior checkpoints and an undisclosed number of secondary checkpoints within 100 miles of the southern border. Many of you may know that federal border and immigration agents have broad authority within 100 miles of land and sea borders or any coastline to conduct warrantless searches. While the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution is intended to protect all people against unreasonable search, CBP officers are granted extraordinary powers to stop, frisk, interrogate, detain, and arrest without warrants within this zone, prompting human rights advocates to call it a, quote, Constitution-free zone. Think about it. 100 miles of any land border or coastline means that 2/3 of the entire population of the United States is subject to warrantless searches by federal agents. That's Boston, New York, the entire state of Florida, Los Angeles, Portland, Seattle, and of course, here. So let me turn briefly from the impact that border militarization is having on human communities to its impact on wildlands. This is Quito Baquito Springs. Has anybody been there in the group? Okay, it's really lovely. It's the only source of water for miles at the southern boundary of Oregon National Pipe, or Oregon Pipe National Monument, home to an astonishing number of animal species. For thousands of years, native people have enjoyed and been sustained by its cool waters, and it's sacrum to the O'odham people, whose elders are also buried here. Today, the springs are a fraction of their former self. What was a vast marshland is now a shallow pond. In the 1990s, the springs and surrounding areas were listed as critical habitat and environmental protections were put in place. However, in 2020, despite the objections of community members, environmentalists, and native elders, the Trump administration moved forward with the construction of a border wall about 100 feet from the springs. In doing so, they waived over 20 laws, including ones that protect clean water, endangered species, and Native American cultural sites. How, you might ask? Well, after 9/11, Congress passed the Real ID Act, which, among other things, gave the Director of Homeland Security, an unelected public official, complete authority to waive any laws they deem necessary to expedite the building of border walls and barriers. In 2020, construction crews drilled wells near Quito Baquito to make cement for the wall. Consequently, water levels dropped. Sensing an emergency, Park Service employees scooped out all of the turtles and the fish and relined the pond. The pond has refilled somewhat since, yet biologists remain concerned for the endangered species that inhabit this little oasis. The wall has also negatively impacted such migratory species as pronghorns, javelinas, bobcats, bears, Mexican jaguars, and mountain lions. And the stadium-style lighting at the wall disorients such nocturnal species as bats. But this idea of extra legal authority, right? Going beyond the laws, having extra authority in so-called border exceptions at the southern border is something I want to return to at the end of the lecture. To summarize, border militarization represents a 30-year project that's cost billions of dollars at the expense of border communities and fragile border environments. Further, with this militarization, borders have become areas of exception, where normal legal processes may be altered or ignored. In the name of stopping illegal immigration, cartel violence, and illegal drug trade, the U.S. government has poured billions of dollars into hardening this border, all at the expense of course, the people that live there and the environment. Pristine Sonoran cattle land with alligator junipers, scrub oaks, organ pipe cactus, and magnificent saguaros have been replaced by cement barriers, steel walls, endless rolls of razor wire, drones, towers, blimps, stadium lighting, and armed guards. Has it been worth it, you might ask? Well, we've spent billions on hardening the border to halt the supply of drugs, even though most serious policymakers would tell you that the only way to really curtail drug addiction, including addiction to such killers as meth and fentanyl, is to address the social, psychological, and economic causes of demand. We've been duped into thinking that by sealing off the southern border, essentially trying to halt the supply of drugs, that America's drug problem will go away. Rather than cut addiction programs, as the Trump administration is actively doing, perhaps we might want to better fund them. We've spent billions on hardening the border to halt illegal immigration, even though serious immigration policy would pursue a more orderly approach, including legislation that encouraged people to immigrate the right way. It's so difficult right now to actually immigrate. Serious policy, rather than performance politics at the border, would streamline judicial systems and boost the number of immigration judges. It wouldn't fire judges or cut funding for adjudication, as the Trump administration is doing right now. We have spent billions on hardening the border because we've been told that it's in our best economic interest, even though any serious economist would challenge the wisdom of tariffs and of shuttering, or potentially shuttering, the 3,000 maquiladoras, the factories. Think of it, millions of people out of work, all living and working along the borderline. It just doesn't make sense. We want a strong Mexico with a strong economy. In the class I taught at Montana State for years, I talked a lot about borders being more than lines on a map. Borders are methods. By methods, I mean that they're important tools of the state to shape policy and to control the flow of goods and people. Nations depend on borders. But what I believe we're seeing now at the southern border is something different, and it frightens me. It's more of a weaponization of borders. Right now, law enforcement, surveillance, and exceptional legal methods born at the southern border are being brought to bear elsewhere, challenging some of our basic constitutional rights. The Trump administration has conjured antiquated laws, such as the Alien Enemies Act, to deny due processes and assist in mass deportations, including the Venezuelans who were rushed onto planes and sent to El Salvador. The weaponization of the southern border justifies an exceptional behavior because it's a zone of exception. And all of this because many of these men had tattoos. The Trump administration is ramping up deportations of people that have lived in the U.S. peacefully for years, held down jobs, paid taxes, gone to school, often married to U.S. citizens, and have U.S. children. These folks are being held or deported without due process. Basically, approaches that have characterized the southern border for decades are being modified and mobilized in other parts of the country to enforce laws in a manner that would otherwise be unthinkable. These aren't aliens. They're fathers, mothers, co-workers, and community members. This can take many forms. In 2024, the Department of Homeland Security searched more than 47,000 electronic devices at ports of entry, and indications are that this number is already way up in 2025. In 2019, the Trump administration called in undercover Border Patrol officers, Border Patrol, to bring order to the Black Lives Matter protest in Portland. Think about it, the use of elite Border Patrol agents to pick up people off of the street for domestic protests. It's not hard to imagine how these powers could be expanded and further weaponized, including threaten U.S. citizens. Trump has even floated sending U.S. citizens to prisons in El Salvador. I mean, that's terrifying. Perhaps the most chilling reports are those of the Trump administration's desire to use the southern border as an excuse to invoke the Insurrection Act of 1807. This would allow the administration to deploy active duty troops for law enforcement within the country. That means the possibility of U.S. soldiers stopping people on the streets, demanding identification, or going door to door in searches. In other words, the entire country comes to look and feel like a security state. It's certainly food for thought, and it's not the kind of country I want to be in. On a cheery note, I'd like to turn over the podium to my border studies colleague, Professor Trautman.
Thank you. Thank you so much, LaTrelle. Thank you so much. Okay, as we shift some things up, we'll get Laurie all squared away. I'm going to introduce Laurie Trautman, Dr. Trautman, as she transfers over our technology here. So Dr. Trautman serves as one of the nation's top experts on Canadian and U.S. border, on the Canadian and U.S. border and associated border policies. While she focuses primarily on the Cascadia region of the Washington and British Columbia region, she also collaborates in research both binationally and internationally to advance policy solutions that balance cross-border mobility with efficiency and security. In addition to partnering with faculty and students at Western Washington University, she has working relationships with the private sector and government agencies. A regular contributor to the media, her latest co-authored book, When the World Closed Its Doors, The COVID-19 Tragedy and the Future of Borders, which, by the way, is for sale here today. Thank you, Village Books, for being here. This book explores the expanding use of international borders as a policy response to a growing range of crises and the collateral damage that results. Dr. Trautman participates in working groups that are actively engaged in the U.S.-Canada relationship and is currently a global fellow with the Woodrow Wilson Center and a fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. She holds a PhD in geography from the University of Oregon, a master's in science from Montana State University, and a bachelor's from Western Washington University in environmental economics. I also would like to say, as somebody who works at Western, she is probably the most popular person at Western right now. She has given more than 50 interviews to media since President Trump was elected, including to Globe and Mail, the Boston Globe, Seattle Times, Politico, Washington Post, and many more. So please welcome Laurie Trautman.
It's always a little weird to be talked up like that, but thank you, Chris. I'm going to try to have the mic here, but put your hand up if for some reason you have a hard time hearing me, especially in the back. LaTrelle, that's a little bit of a hard act to follow, but as you were talking, I was sitting here thinking, imagining some of these images from the southern border and what it might feel like to us if the northern border looked like that. I think we have enjoyed 100 years of peace and friendship and trust, and I'm not here to tell you that it's all going to go away. I'm here to tell you I think we have a lot of opportunities to continue to support that relationship and to continue to embrace it. So my talk today is basically divided into two parts. The first is a little bit more of the broader context and the recent background around these massive changes we've seen in the Canada-US sort of relationship and rhetoric and the politicization of that border. And then also I'll shift to sort of look at what does that mean for those of us here in Whatcom County? What are we seeing? What's actually happening on the ground? And end with hopefully some ways that we might be able to counteract some of these trends that I don't think any of us in this room are welcoming. So first, just a little bit about what the Border Policy Research Institute is. We are dedicated to the study of the Canada-US border from a policy perspective, and we are the only academically based research institute in the US that does this. I still have on my slides that I'm a global fellow with the Woodrow Wilson Center's Canada Institute, but just a couple weeks ago, that program was shut down and no longer exists. So we have a shrinking capacity in our understanding of the Canada-US relationship here. And kudos to Western for creating this institute 20 years ago with the foresight that this was a very important thing for us to understand. So we do a lot of different types of research. Up here, you can see on the right some of our more recent sort of trade stuff, looking at what is the trade relationship between Washington and British Columbia. Oh, geez, this is going to be a thing. This picture down here is one of our students at Western up at the border, asking people sort of where they're going, why they're crossing as they cross the border. So we do a lot of field work to collect really relevant information that would not otherwise exist. And I would say that there are many areas along the Canada-US border where these types of resources don't exist, and we don't have as good of an understanding of the influence of the border. We also work, as Chris mentioned, with a lot of stakeholders, a lot of media recently. This picture up here is some collaborators at Simon Fraser University. We also work very closely with the University of Victoria. And I also work with the border agencies themselves and the transportation agencies. So this is a collaborative discussion between USCBP and the Washington State Department of Transportation. We do policy publications. These are very short. These are very concise and very sort of accessible. So they're 2-4 pages. Sometimes we're just sort of explaining the state of things. We did a lot of these during COVID when the border restrictions were very confusing to people, and it was very difficult to just sort of figure out what the state of play was. And then in the middle is a photo of some regional stakeholders. If you can see, Governor Gregoire is in the middle, and we've got Microsoft and our consul generals in there as well. And this is a group that comes together on a larger scale called the Cascadia Innovation Corridor to really sort of tie together Vancouver and Seattle more. And, we're right in the middle of that. So it's really important for us to be a part of those conversations and not sort of overshadowed by the big cities to the north and the south. So I want to start out, because I do study border policy and the border itself, of course, by showing you a map of the border. The Canada-US border is the longest border in the world. It's often described as undefended, as an open border, for better or for worse. But this used to be something that we really celebrated. And the idea around an open border isn't necessarily that anybody can just come and go freely, but it's that it can look and feel open without a wall because it's well managed and it's collaborative. And we trust each other to manage that border. So I'm going to read to you a quote by Ronald Reagan in 1988, really capturing that sentiment of the Canada-US border that I think has held for decades and has really shaped how we work on the border and in turn sort of the influence that border has on our communities. Let the 5,000-mile border between Canada and the United States stand as a symbol for the future. No soldier stands guard to protect it, barbed wire does not deface it, and no invisible barrier of economic suspicion and fear will extend it. Let it forever be not a point of division, but a meeting place between our great and true friends. And I read that and I feel the same way. Thank you. But now, of course, we have to fast forward to the current state of affairs. I'm sorry to read this, but I have to, which is President Trump's description of the Canada-US border. Gang members, smugglers, human traffickers, and illicit drugs of all kinds have poured across our borders and into our communities. Canada has played a central role in these challenges, including by failing to devote sufficient attention and resources or meaningfully coordinate with U.S. law enforcement partners to effectively stem the tide of illicit drugs. And now I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that there isn't any illicit drugs or any irregular migration moving across our borders, but we have always worked together to manage that. So to me, the most troubling component of that quote is actually pointing a finger at Canada and said, you've done nothing to work with us. So how did we get to a place where not just the border, but that narrative around its influence has so fundamentally shifted? As I said, the Reagan quote might be a little bit dated, but I think it really held until about 9 years ago, honestly, with the first Trump administration. So I'm going to tell this tale through the story of two parks. And I think how politics, we can really see how politics are reflected in the landscape by looking at these two different parks. So one is the Peace Arch Park. How many of you have been to Peace Arch Park? Oh, okay, great. So you'll probably know that it was, the arch itself was constructed just over 100 years ago to memorialize 100 years of peace between the US and Canada, and before that, Great Britain. And then if you drive all the way south to the southern border, back there a little bit, is Friendship Park. This is gonna drive me nuts. Should I switch these out or just roll with it? Okay. This is a picture of First Lady Pat Nixon dedicating Friendship Park in 1971, and it's probably a little hard to see, but there's some barbed wire in between her and the people on the other side of the fence. And when she dedicated this park, she actually modeled it after the Peace Arch Park to a certain extent. She said, we've got these parks on the northern border, these binational spaces where communities can be together. And she dedicated this park and she said, I hope this barbed wire won't be here much longer. Obviously, that's not what happened. It went the other way. So I used to often talk about the differences between the Canada-US border and the US-Mexico border by just showing images from these parks that I think really sort of reveal the broader politics around these borders. So Friendship Park has become increasingly difficult to access. Started with barbed wire, ended with these mesh walls. There's even more built up environment now. There used to be an area where people could come together. It was sort of this little monitored space that some people have said feels more like a prison than a park. And today Friendship Park is closed. It was closed during COVID and it has not reopened. So the US side is not accessible. We've actually spoken with some people from Friendship Park who have come up to look at Peace Arch Park to sort of get some ideas for what the vision for that park could potentially be someday. So you contrast that to the Peace Arch Park, which if you've ever been there on a beautiful sunny day, it feels like any other park, right? The exception is that you have people coming from both sides of the border to be together. Hugely important community space, a huge cultural treasure for our region. And the language on the arch reads things like children dwelling together in unity and may these gates never close. And the importance of the park was particularly heightened during COVID when the border was heavily restricted to most travel. Some of you may have been in the park during this time. It was called the Summer of Love because so many people, thousands of people came to the park who would otherwise have been separated by the border. And I don't think you can read that text, but this is a couple getting married who said, we didn't want to wait for the world to figure out what they were going to do. We wanted to get married, and being in the park was their only opportunity because they were from both sides of the border. This is a very touching story of a man named Bill Zwedmere, who had been diagnosed with terminal cancer, and being in the park was his last opportunity to hold his grandson. So an incredibly, incredibly meaningful place. And the tents have become sort of a joke because that was sort of the adult section where couples who are separated could be together. People love that story. But an incredible asset for us, and it's remained that asset because it's been managed. I'm not going to stand up here and say there's no Border Patrol. There's Border Patrol, there's cameras. There are eyes on this space, but because it's been managed collaboratively and it's been managed well, it's been to continue to be open. Now, unfortunately, COVID drew a lot of people to the park. It also brought a lot of attention to the park. And so it wasn't just an increase in families and friends that we saw in the park. We did see an uptick in irregular migration and human smuggling through the park. And what that has led to is this post-COVID restriction of park access. So this began with signs by Border Patrol saying you can't cross here, you have to go through the port of entry. It led to Border Patrol putting up this on their Facebook page that said this is not an entrance, you can no longer walk through here. And today, the Washington state side of the park is closed to Canadians. So you can still be in the archway together from both sides, but Canadians can no longer come into the park where the playgrounds are, where the picnic tables are, where the chairs are, where most families really want to be. So I think the changes in the Peace Arch Park are a little bit of maybe not a precursor, but they do reflect the broader, maybe that'll work better, okay. They do reflect broader changes at the political level that should concern us. And again, the park is just sort of symptomatic of what we've seen along the entire Canada-US border, which is this post-COVID shift in rhetoric. So one thing I want to recognize, again, is that we did see an uptick in irregular migration across the Canada-US border, which I think is to be expected after the COVID years. Very little migration was happening during COVID. The US had a policy that essentially allowed us to turn away asylum seekers on the basis of public health protection. So this was sort of a rebounding effect that we saw on both borders. The challenge is it happened leading up to a US presidential election. So we started to see in 2023 and particularly in 2024, this real sort of seizing of these trends on the northern border for political reasons. You saw things in the news like this, which are maybe, we're talking about building a wall with Canada. We're worried about sort of these terrorist issues, and I'm happy to answer why those existed. But even people like Nikki Haley, which now seems pretty moderate, would go on the campaign trail and say, we don't talk enough about the northern border. We will do a wall. We will do any sort of border that we need to, whatever it takes to keep people out from coming in. So, this language of fear and insecurity really started to creep into our approach to the northern border. And that idea of what that border should look like and how it should be managed started to shift well before the second Trump administration. And that's where we come to the Canada-US border as a site of political theater, really sort of building on, again, what LaTrelle has talked about has been the case for decades on the US-Mexican border. This did not used to be the case on the US-Canada border. The work that I did was pretty boring, pretty mundane. It was essentially trying to make a border that already work better. And now we're in a whole new territory. So a bit of a shameless plug for the book that I wrote with my co-author, Ted Alden. What we did during this book is we looked at countries around the world that really used borders to react to the pandemic. And our essential takeaway is that COVID laid the groundwork for the normalization of borders as a policy response to an increasing diversity of emergencies. So in the US-Canada context, we had a few things at play. We had increasing irregular migration. And I should add, this wasn't just into the US. It was actually also northbound going into Canada as well. It was both directions. We had a real breakdown in Canada-US collaboration on the border coming out of COVID. We didn't innovate coming out of COVID like we did coming out of 9/11. And then, of course, we had the US presidential election. So this idea that borders can protect us, that somehow restricting the mobility of not just foreigners, but of citizens as well, is an adequate and appropriate policy tool is really sort of a new approach to the northern border. And as LaTrelle argued, and I couldn't agree with more, very rarely have borders been successful at doing things like reducing drug use or irregular migration for that matter. So I want to read to you a ruling from the US Supreme Court from 2 years ago. And this was a ruling regarding the US use of pandemic border restrictions. And it was that policy that I mentioned where the US said we are not going to process asylum claims because migrants could be a public health threat. This was called Title 42. And this was an opinion by Justice Gorsuch, who said, "Doubtless, many lessons can be learned from this chapter in our history, and hopefully serious efforts will be made to study it. One lesson might be this: fear and the desire for safety are powerful forces. They can lead to a clamor for action, almost any action, as long as someone else does something to address a perceived threat. The current border crisis is not a COVID crisis, but rather an emergency decree designed for one crisis in order to address an entirely different one. But if emergency decrees promise to solve some problems, they threaten to generate others. And a rule by indefinite emergency edict risks leaving all of us with a shell of a democracy and civil liberties just as hollow." So I think when we think about borders, we often think about foreigners, about people from outside of the country. But as we erode those rights, we're really eroding our own rights as well. And I think it's shocking to me that this was a statement made 2 years ago, and it's something that we are really, really seeing play out today, which is using borders in an emergency context to achieve other means. And nowhere is this more apparent than when we come to the topic of tariffs, and particularly tariffs on Canada. So many of you have probably heard this language around, this is from the executive order, this unusual and extraordinary threat about illegal aliens coming into the country from Canada, about fentanyl coming in. And many of us sort of scratched our heads when this first came out. Well, there's less than 1% of undocumented immigrants come from Canada. Less than 1% of fentanyl comes across the border from Canada. Well, that's because it turns out that this really has nothing to do with border security. It was a way for the Trump administration to invoke what's called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act by claiming a national security emergency at the border. And that allowed him to implement tariffs on Canada that otherwise would not have been possible. So he says in this statement, "This national emergency requires decisive and immediate action, and I've decided to impose tariffs to address this unusual and extraordinary threat." So if you think back to what Justice Gorsuch said, this is almost play-by-play, the same sort of approach. So I'm going to shift now to the second part and focus on what all of this means for our region. Look a little bit at travel, at trade, and at cross-border relations. So what I've seen over the last couple months is that the border is thickening in both directions. And by thickening, I mean it's becoming more costly, time-consuming, difficult to cross. These are just a few images from sort of the Canadian response to some US actions. There is no enemy like a friend betrayed. And then, of course, Mike Myers, for any of you who are Mike Myers fans on SNL, sort of with his Canadian pride pushing back. So Canada-US relations, I think if you ask anybody that's studied these, are at an all-time low. I don't think since we were fighting wars with Great Britain had things been so bad up here on the northern border. 50% of Canadians who were recently polled approach the US as a threat to national interests, and about a quarter think the US will close its border again. And I actually think that the border closure piece is really important for us here, because if you are somebody who is measuring your future actions based on whether or not you'll be able to cross the border, if you think it's going to close, that is really going to impact your family relations, if you have investment decisions, business relocations, things like that. I'm just going to sort of assume everybody's heard the 51st state rhetoric. If there's one thing that hits the nerve of Canadians, it's sovereignty. And I have to say the Trump administration did a stellar job at hitting that nerve. And what we've seen, of course, in response is increasing anti-American sentiment, buy Canadian movement, boycotting U.S. travel. I was in Vancouver a couple months ago for a Vancouver Board of Trade event, and there was sort of this joke, oh, well, you know, our premier is boycotting liquor from red states, but we're still buying all that great Washington and Oregon wine, and we all chuckled. And then just a couple weeks later, the premier banned all imports of all U.S. Liquor. And that's about a $100 million industry for Washington state that goes to Canada. We're also seeing a changing nature of border enforcement. And this is, again, in both directions, not just coming into the U.S. When Canada responded to the initial UF tariff threats, they put on counter tariffs. And one of those measures was a 25% surcharge on personal goods. So if you were a Canadian who wanted to come down to the U.S. despite the politics and despite the weak dollar, which is an important component here as well, and purchase something, you're now hit with an additional 25% tax at the border, which really makes it, you know, absolutely not worth it. We're also seeing more enforcement of the collection of duties and taxes that had always been on the books, but was sort of, you know, more often than not enforced. And then, of course, on the U.S. side, some very high-profile media stories around people being detained, people being treated very egregiously. I do want to say that that is the vast minority of people, and these are media stories that are sensational, but that doesn't make them any less egregious. They're still horrible situations. So we're hearing from Canadians that are just not making that trip because they don't want to deal with it, even if it's simply just a matter of a little more questioning. That doesn't feel good to them. And then at the same time, even as volumes are down, we're seeing increasing wait times coming into the U.S. And we've seen this in the past when there's fewer travelers, Border Protection spends more time with each of them. So increased wait times makes your trip even that much more or less predictable. But I think overall, too, I just want to point out that like the loss of trust that is undermining this relationship is going to be really, really difficult to repair. Because trust takes a long time to rebuild. So just a couple of the numbers, because I'm kind of a border policy geek. This is Canadian vehicles entering Linden, Sumas, and Blaine, so our main 4 points of entry into Whatcom County. So coming out of COVID, after 2021, we saw a continual increase month over month, year over year of Canadians resuming their cross-border travel. And I should add the majority of cross-border travel at our ports is by Canadians. That held through until January of this year, where 2023, 2024, 2025, each year that was increasing. And then that trend reversed in February. February was the same month that the tariffs were announced. And then that trend continued in March. And in March of this year, compared to March the year before, we saw a drop of around 43% in Canadian vehicles. And then for the first couple weeks in April, that actually increased to 52%. There are some other factors at play. The carbon tax has been repealed in Canada. That makes gas a lot less expensive. People crossing the border for gas is actually a very large trip purpose here in our region. But overall, the takeaway is we are seeing an increase in those declining number of visits by Canadians. So a few more observed and anecdotal trends. We're hearing businesses, particularly in places like Blaine, not to mention Point Roberts, that their drops in sales are as much as 60%. Bellingham hotel capacity had declined 12% in February. This is a graph that shows basically different border areas across the Canada-US border, hotel occupancy. And for those of you who can't see, Bellingham is at the bottom. We're higher than all of those other areas in terms of our drop in hotel occupancy. Another very important one for here, those of us who prefer not to have to drive to Seattle to fly out of Bellingham, is a drastic drop in Canadian vehicles at the Bellingham International Airport. Typically about 60% of passengers at BLI are Canadian. If we didn't have our Canadian passengers, we would not have as much flight service in and out of Bellingham. I did hear from the port recently that flights haven't shown a decline yet, but I think there's a bit of a delay in when we will see that happen. And I will say it's still early days, and summer is really when we will have a better understanding of these impacts. But all of this creates a massive strain on families and on loved ones who have to decide, are people still going to come down to the U.S. and visit their family and friends, or are those sort of relationships going to have to shift? So I said I wasn't going to get too much into U.S.-Canada trade war. I think it's very messy. It's very dynamic. It's very hard to predict what the impacts might be because the policy might shift tomorrow. So I'll just quickly put this up here and say between Canada and the U.S., we are mostly operating under our free trade agreement, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, with carve-outs here and there. Some of those carve-outs could hit Whatcom County particularly hard. We have a 10% charge on energy. We depend quite a bit on electricity from British Columbia here. The 25% charge on steel and aluminum. We have shipbuilding here. We have industries that rely on that imported aluminum and steel. So these will hit us in different ways that maybe don't remain to be seen. Some of them may already be being felt, but they could change at any moment. And then from the Canadian perspective, counter tariffs as well. So some industries to consider, I'm going to actually skip through this and say that one thing we've been trying to do at our institute is provide some graphics for how we might impact these or experience these tariffs in different way. And we have a great thriving craft brew industry here. They are experiencing increases in their steel components and their aluminum components. So whether that's the brewing equipment or that's the cans of beer themselves. So we've tried to kind of put some context into those numbers for those goods that we make here and that we enjoy consuming. So finally, what is at stake and how might we respond? So I like to point out that our cross-border relationships influence us in many different ways. Certainly, we have a lot of trade moving through here, $18 billion in bilateral trade just through our Whatcom County ports of entry. Typically, we welcome over 5 million trips made by Canadians, again, just into Whatcom County. They are shopping, they are recreating, they are, homeowners, etc. We have this shared natural environment that you can't fix the environment on one side of the border and not on the other and expect it to go very far. And then our disaster response, I think, is really important in Whatcom County. Many of you will remember the Nooksack River floods, where the Nooksack River spilled over the banks into Canada. There is no way to respond to these disasters that know no borders without working together very closely with our Canadian neighbors. We also have the 2026 FIFA Men's World Cup games coming. They're coming to places throughout North America. But Vancouver and Seattle are the only cities that straddle the border. And us here in Whatcom County are, of course, right in the middle of that. So making sure that we are able to welcome people from all over the world who do want to visit games on both sides of the border is going to require a lot of collaboration and communication. So what can we do? I don't have great answers. I think just being here in this room and talking about these issues is really important. I think engaged citizens is probably the only answer. But there are some lessons that we can pull from. And some of those were what we did during COVID when the border was essentially closed. We shared information. We kept stakeholders engaged. We did not depend on the media for our news because the media, frankly, often gets it wrong. We shared the knowledge on the ground, and there's some of us in the room who are really trying to do that. The Port of Bellingham, the small city mayors, the Tourism Bureau, the Chamber, trying to make sure that we have a good sense of what these impacts are. I think we also have an opportunity to really highlight the value and the impact of those cross-border connections because they are very vulnerable right now. We should engage in efforts that bring benefits to both sides of the border. I mentioned the Nooksack River floods. Any sort of disaster response is really important for us to continue to collaborate on. But it has to bring benefits to the north side of the border as well. And of course, our environmental health. So I'll sort of close with the last few slides in saying that I think it's time for regional community-based engagement. And there's some good examples of that both here and both in communities at the other end of the US-Canada border. So I'm curious if anybody here has participated in the Peace Arch rally. Okay, we've got a couple, great. So peace, love, and a handshake. People are going up to the Peace Arch, and that's all it is. Just, hey, we're still here. We still support you. And when things get a little less crazy, we'll be able to resume those relations more valuably and maybe with less of a delay than if we just sort of fall off with those connections. Another really great example of community engagement happened at the Haskell Free Library. Some of you may have heard this library. It's in Vermont, and it's a library that the border literally runs through. And I think it was last month, Homeland Security said Canadians can no longer enter this library. It's been like this for 100 years, where Americans and Canadians have shared this library space. And so they said that Canadians who want to come to the library have to go through the port of entry, which is sort of what's happening now at the Peace Arch Park. And the library said, well, we're going to raise $100,000 and we're going to build a ramp that allows them to go from Canada to the Canadian side of the library. You know, screw you, we're not following this. And they raised $186,000. So they're finding ways around these challenges. So I'll close by saying, don't underestimate the value of soft diplomacy. We don't have to have formal channels. They don't have to be structured. There's a lot of different ways that we can connect. Subnational collaboration is still strong. The Washington Senate just passed a resolution recently recognizing the immeasurable value of our relationship with Canada. There's a lot of cross-border initiatives and coalitions. These do face some unique challenges, but they are continuing. It's not business as usual, but business is still happening. I work with a number of them that are involved in transportation, in security, and in governance, and they're not going away. They're still here, and people are still meeting. And I'll finally say, I think our region holds the most promise for counteracting these binational tensions. My predecessor, Don Alper, who maybe some of you have met in the past, he used to say that if we can't do it here, no one else along the Canada-US border can do it. We have come up with so many innovative ways of working together. We have a lot of capacity, a lot of engaged stakeholders. So we should be leading the way in finding these solutions. So thanks. That's it.
All right, Laurie and LaTrelle are going to come up to the tables up here. We've got about 15 minutes for questions. And while they get squared away here, and while we get our microphones squared away, I do have a couple questions that I'm sure are burning in some of your minds. And the first question is that many folks have benefited from swift access across the border using Nexus. Can you share with the audience what Nexus is and its history, and does Mexico have a similar program, and do we need to worry about it going away?
So how many of you have Nexus cards? Oh my gosh, wow, amazing. So I don't have to explain what it is, but for the few that don't, it's basically TSA for the land border. So if you've ever been in line at the border and those cars are flying by you, they're people that have Nexus cards. And the Nexus program is really unique because it's a joint program between the US and Canada. So all that information is shared, all that intelligence is shared. When you apply for your Nexus card, as many of you have done, you have an interview with a Canadian officer and a US officer side by side. There is no parallel on the US-Mexico border. There's something called Sentry, but that's for US entry only. So the Nexus program is unique because it's so collaborative, but it's vulnerable because it is built on a relationship of trust. And you know, without getting too long-winded, it basically closed down during COVID, and it reopened in a very different way. And if you're in Canada and you want to get your Nexus card, unless you can come down to the US and do your dual interview at the same time, you now can no longer do an interview with an American officer and a Canadian officer together in Canada. And that happened because there was an issue of trust between the US and Canada. I'm happy to answer, why that happened, but that's all to say that that is a vulnerable program, even though it's a flagship program. And it's a program that actually started right here at Peace Arch. It used to be called the Peace Arch Crossing Entry Program, the PACE program. So it's also a great example of how our region developed something really innovative, and then it was taken and turned into policy and used across the Canada-US border. So we should be proud of that program. And I do think, though, it could be a little bit vulnerable. Yeah.
Thank you. Anything you have to add, or are you ready for my next question? All right. The next question that I do have, and then we'll open it up, is how have Native people and lands been impacted by efforts to secure the southern border?
No one knows the power of borders more than our Native populations, right? borders have been the way that their lands have been taken away from them for years. So I think there is a bit of a trauma response, you might say, with all of this federal overreach and security at both the Canadian border with Native populations and at the southern border. I think I've read of some of the instances at the Mohawk Nation of them really pushing back against what they thought was overreach from Border Patrol and border security. So I'm most familiar and most interested in the Tohono O'odham Nation. It's the second largest nation of indigenous people in Arizona. It encompasses a landmass equal to the size of Connecticut and runs 60 miles along the southern border, kind of between Nogales and Oregon Pipe. So the O'odham Nation used to cross the border, right? Its traditional lands are across both Mexico and Arizona. And in 1853, with the Gadsden Treaty, it put the borderline squarely between the nation, dividing part of the tribal community from the other. That hasn't been too much of a problem until the past 20 years or so, right? When border security started becoming such an issue. And as borders to the east and to the west have gotten more fortified, more security, it's pinched migration directly through their nation, leaving them really super vulnerable to drug smuggling and to a number of the brunt of migration through their communities. So they have been, I think, very. They know that they need the help of the U.S. government to help secure their border or to keep a lot of this in order. It's posed all kinds of problems. There are 13 security towers along the border for them. They do have a border barrier fence. They've kind of pushed back and said, no, we're not going to allow, the 30-foot, very obnoxious border fencing walls that we see other places. And it's presented all sorts of other issues, They are often stopped, ask what they're doing, and they're like, I live, half a mile down the road. Why do I need to tell you where I'm going or what I'm doing? There are checkpoints that they must go through as they go to get groceries. It's just been, it's been a huge intrusion and inconvenience, particularly as they try to cross the border and have get together with their fellow tribal members, their relatives on the other side in Mexico. Now they have to call or go online in advance and set up an appointment, okay, wow, in advance to go see their other tribal members on the Mexico side.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there so we can have some time because I bet there's one or two questions out here.
And I want to remind everyone that Village Books is still here with Dr. Trautman's book and a variety of other fine titles for you to review as you leave. And
thank you. This is to both of you, but it's with regard to Nexus. I've had Nexus for 10 years. I've crossed the border thousands of times on Nexus in the course of my work, going back and forth. The one problem that I have, and you alluded to it a bit, Laurie, is modifications to Nexus. Because if there is a lack of the ability to cross the border and a lack of due process to challenge a border agent who may take something from you, or there are all kinds of ways to lose your Nexus card. And I'd like to know if there's any plans on putting together some type of process whereby a person who has had his or her Nexus card taken can apply to have it reissued immediately, because it makes a big difference in terms of being able to get back and forth across the border. And it's more than just travel, and it's business and commerce as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Our region also has the highest enrollment of Nexus anywhere on the Canada-US border. Many of us depend on it. I couldn't do my job if I didn't have a Nexus card, and it's often been a black hole where your Nexus card gets revoked or you get denied, and there's no way to get a good answer. And honestly, it's a question for the attorneys that can do that work and push it forward. And there is a local attorney here who has tried to find ways to get those answers, but I can't speak to the fruition of that.
I guess I'm next. I'd like to back out a little bit. Could you comment on what the hardening of the borders and the consequential distrust, what effects that's had on international treaties? Here in Washington and Oregon and British Columbia, we have two important treaties, the Pacific Salmon Treaty, which is an ongoing management issue as well as up for renegotiation, and the Columbia River Treaty, which is a treaty dealing with water supply and electricity, which I understand is currently paused. On the south, the Colorado River Treaty, I believe Mr. Trump has simply told Mexico he's not going to honor it. Could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, the Columbia River Treaty, we have been negotiating it for, 7 years now, at least. Chris and I actually, back in 2018 or 2019, held a forum at Western talking about, ways of modifying the Columbia River Treaty. We had the lead negotiators here from the State Department and BC and the Canadian federal government. And it dragged on and it dragged on, and unfortunately it dragged on into this administration. And the norms of that international engagement are all out the window. So, this is a treaty that has a lot of different components to it: flood management, electricity, salmon restoration, and it's up in the air. And I don't have an answer to where it might go, but it is completely unresolved. I don't know if you know anything about the Colorado River.
Oh,
stuff.
no, I don't. That's not.
Okay, one thing, and that is both listening to your talk and listening to social media, the media, and people now who are spreading tales. There is an atmosphere of fear now. Don't cross the border. Buy another phone. Don't take your laptop. Don't take your iPad. They'll put you in prison. They'll strip search you. I mean, that's all out there. And this is what Trump depends on: fear. And what I'm seeing in this country is more fear than anger. And what can we do to direct anger at this administration?
Wow. I think the longer that this goes on, the more people, I hope, will respond and will be proactive in their response. I attended the Hands Off rally, as I'm sure many of you did, and I was really encouraged at the number of people that were willing to come out to speak truth to power, because that's what we're doing here, and not stop talking because we're fearful. And, I think that's what we have to do, is just stand up for the truth, call out the lies. If you hear something that's not true, that fentanyl is pouring over the Canadian border, right? Or that cartels have moved into, Texas, and they're taking over Texas border communities. Speak truth to power. That's not my community, right? That's not the community I know. And hopefully if we stand up enough, then we'll start to change that narrative.
And I think the risk is, we let the fear take over, which justifies actions that may be unretractable. And something I've been trying to do is, not just live in my own media bubble, but look at what the other side, I shouldn't say the other side, that's too divisive. Look at a broad landscape of media narratives to try to understand what those other perspectives are, because there are other perspectives, and the way we consume our media is really feeding into so much divisions into these situations. So the more we can cross over out of our sort of silos and comfort zones and try to have conversations with people that might see things differently, and just try to have that outreach in whatever platform that is. I think that's worthwhile.
So in an era where states' rights seem to be something that our federal government supports, is there a way for Washington or even a county to be able to negotiate a different way to commence trade between our neighbors and us? You get the gist of what I'm asking?
Yeah.
I mean, Governor Newsom is doing this with California and trying to forge trade relationships that are outside of what the government is proposing.
Yeah, and it's a good question. And we tried to do things like that during COVID a little bit, where, could we have sort of a BC Washington bubble when infection rates were low on both sides? That proved intractable, not just because of the jurisdiction of the border, but because politically it was not popular for the premier of British Columbia to engage in that. And so I do think the answer to your question is yes, there are ways to do that. We have here in Whatcom County free trade zones. That is a way to get around some of the tariff stuff, where you can import something into the U.S. in a free trade zone, and as long as it doesn't enter the U.S. market and it leaves, it sort of circumvents those tariffs. Now, there's a lot of parameters around that, but there's tools here and there. But the politics on the Canadian side are really tough right now for doing things that look like they're helping people in the United States. So if we can move beyond those politics, I do think, at the end of the day, our subnational relations are great between Washington and British Columbia. And there is a recognition that we have a lot of connections and like-minded folks. So where there's a will, there's a way, but I'm not sure there's a will right now. Maybe.
All right, it is the end of our program. Please put your hands together for Laurie Trautman and LaTrelle Scherffius. And make sure you come here next month. We will be doing an update on what is happening with our jail here in Whatcom County. So we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.